My name is Catherine, and I'm a cardiac surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital. 23 years ago, my father looked me in the eye and said I was too stupid to ever become a doctor. Last Tuesday, I held his heart in my hands while he lay unconscious on my operating table. What happened between those two moments would change both of our lives forever, reveal family secrets that had been buried for decades, and force me to confront the man who nearly destroyed my dreams before they even began. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of our colonial house in Westfield, New Jersey, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that my mother polished religiously every Saturday. I was 17, sitting at the kitchen table, with my acceptance letters spread out like playing cards, each one representing a different future I could barely imagine. Rutgers, Penn State, Boston University. My grades had been exceptional, my SAT scores in the 98th percentile, and my volunteer work at the local animal shelter had given me my first taste of what caring for living beings felt like, but none of that mattered to my father, Dr. Richard Brennan. He was a successful orthopedic surgeon who owned 3 medical practices across northern New Jersey, a man whose presence filled every room he entered with an authority that came from 30 years of being right about broken bones and torn ligaments. When he looked at me that morning, his coffee mug suspended halfway to his lips, I saw something in his eyes I'd been seeing my whole life but never understood until that moment. Disappointment. You want to study what? He asked, setting down his mug with deliberate precision. The morning newspaper lay folded beside his plate, the business section visible because that's what successful men read first. He'd always told me pre-med, I repeated, my voice smaller than I'd intended. I want to be a doctor, like you. My mother, Patricia, looked up from the stove where she was scrambling eggs for my younger brother Mason. She had this way of freezing when tension entered the room, as if staying perfectly still might make her invisible to whatever storm was coming. I'd seen her do it countless times over the years, and I was only just beginning to understand why. Richard laughed, but there was no warmth in it. The sound was sharp, clinical, like the snapping of surgical scissors. Catherine, sweetheart, you can barely get through chemistry without tutoring. Medical school requires a level of intellectual rigor that, honestly, I'm not sure you possess. The words hit me like cold water. I stared at him, waiting for the smile that would indicate he was joking, the warm chuckle that would take back the cruelty. Neither came. Dad, I have a 3.97 GPA. I scored 1580 on my SATs. Dr. Martinez at the animal clinic said I have natural instincts with animals, and I've been volunteering there for 2 years. I've already taken advanced placement courses in biology, chemistry, and physics. Catherine, he interrupted, leaning back in his chair with the kind of casual authority that came from never being challenged. Book smarts aren't the same as real intelligence. Medicine requires quick thinking under pressure, the ability to make life-or-death decisions in seconds. It requires a certain hardness, a capacity to compartmentalize emotions that frankly, you don't have. I felt my cheeks burning. What do you mean? You cry when we watch movies? You couldn't even dissect a frog in biology class without getting upset. Last month, you sobbed for an hour when that stray cat died at the clinic. Medicine isn't for sensitive people, Catherine. It's for people who can look at suffering and see solutions, not feel overwhelmed by emotions. My mother finally moved, turning from the stove with a plate of eggs that she set in front of Mason, who was 14 and absorbed in his phone, trying to pretend he wasn't listening to our family implode over breakfast. Maybe she could try nursing, Patricia offered quietly. That's a wonderful profession for women. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Nursing. Not that there was anything wrong with nursing, but it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to diagnose, to operate, to make the kinds of decisions that saved lives. I wanted to be like my father, respected and needed and capable of miracles. Richard nodded approvingly at his wife's suggestion. Now that's practical thinking. Nursing would suit Catherine much better. It's nurturing, supportive work. Leave the real medical decisions to people who can handle them. I looked down at the acceptance letters scattered across the table. Boston University had one of the best pre-med programs in the country. Penn State had offered me a partial scholarship. Rutgers would let me stay close to home while pursuing my dreams. But suddenly, all I could see were my father's words written across each envelope. Too stupid, too sensitive, not capable. What about pediatrics? I asked desperately. Kids need doctors who care about them, who understand their fears. Maybe being emotional would be an advantage there. Richard's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pity. Catherine, pediatricians still need to understand complex medical conditions, perform procedures, make critical decisions. A sick child isn't going to get better because their doctor cried with them. They need someone who knows what they're doing. Mason finally looked up from his phone, his young face troubled. Dad, Catherine's really smart though. She helps me with my homework all the time, and she explains things better than my teachers. Intelligence comes in many forms, son, Richard replied, his tone gentler when addressing my brother. Catherine is certainly good at memorizing information for tests, but that's very different from the kind of analytical thinking required for medicine. She's better suited for something that uses her natural empathy. Teaching, maybe, or social work. The suggestion felt like a door slamming shut. Not because teaching or social work weren't valuable professions, but because they weren't my choice. I had dreamed of medicine since I was 12 years old, when I'd broken my arm falling from the oak tree in our backyard. The emergency room doctor who'd set my bone had been calm, confident, in complete control of a situation that had left me terrified and crying. I wanted to be that person for someone else someday, the one who could take away fear and pain with knowledge and skill. Dad, what if I prove you wrong? What if I get into medical school and do well? He smiled then, but it wasn't kind. Sweetheart, I've been practicing medicine for 3 decades. I've seen brilliant residents burn out, talented medical students fail their boards, and gifted doctors crack under pressure. This isn't about proving me wrong. This is about being realistic about your limitations before you waste 4 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars discovering them the hard way. Patricia refilled his coffee cup without being asked, a gesture so automatic it was clear she'd been doing it for 20 years. She caught my eye briefly, and in that moment I saw something I'd never noticed before. A kind of resigned sadness, as if she'd had her own dreams dismissed at the same kitchen table long ago. But I don't understand. I pressed on. You always said I could be anything I wanted to be. When I was little, you used to bring me to your office sometimes, and I loved watching you work. You said I asked good questions, that I was observant. Richard's face softened slightly, as if he was remembering those days too. You were a lovely child, Catherine. Curious and sweet. But childhood curiosity isn't the same as having the intellectual capacity for one of the most demanding professions in the world. I'm trying to save you from heartbreak. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft scraping of Mason's fork against his plate and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Anderson next door starting her car for her morning commute to the accounting firm where she'd worked for 15 years. Everything seemed so normal, so routine, while my world was quietly collapsing. I gathered up the acceptance letters, my hands trembling slightly. Maybe I should think about this more. That's very mature of you, Richard said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. There are so many wonderful careers that would be perfect for someone with your temperament. You could help people in other ways. As I walked toward the stairs, clutching the letters against my chest, I heard my mother whisper something to my father. I couldn't make out the words, but his response was clear enough. Patricia, I'm doing what's best for her. Better she learns her limitations now than fails spectacularly later. In my room, I spread the letters across my bed and stared at them until the words blurred together. Boston University's letter began with, "Congratulations on your outstanding academic achievements." Penn State mentioned my exceptional potential in the sciences. Rutgers praised my demonstrated commitment to helping others. But all I could hear was my father's voice, too stupid, too sensitive, not capable. I picked up my phone and called my best friend, Morgan Walsh, who lived 3 streets over and had been my study partner since freshman year. She answered on the second ring. "Cat? What's wrong? You sound awful." I told her about the conversation at breakfast, about my father's assessment of my capabilities, about the weight of his words settling over my dreams like a shroud. "Are you kidding me right now?" Morgan's voice was sharp with indignation. "Catherine, you're literally the smartest person I know. You tutored me through calculus, you aced organic chemistry, and you've been volunteering at that animal clinic longer than anyone. Your dad is being completely ridiculous, but what if he's right?" I asked. "What if I'm not cut out for this? He's been a doctor for 30 years. He knows what it takes." "You know what I think? I think your dad is threatened by the idea that you might be as good as he is. Some parents can't handle their kids outshining them." The possibility had never occurred to me. My father, threatened by me? It seemed impossible. He was Dr. Richard Brennan, respected in his field, wealthy, successful. What could he possibly feel threatened by? "I don't know, Morgan. Maybe he just sees something in me that I can't see in myself. Or maybe he sees something in you that scares him." After we hung up, I sat on my bed for another hour, turning Morgan's words over in my mind. My father had built his identity around being the medical expert in our family, the one whose knowledge and skills were beyond question. Every dinner conversation that touched on health or science, he dominated. Every family crisis, he handled with professional competence. What would it mean for his sense of self if his daughter, the one he saw as too sensitive and emotional, succeeded in his field? But that night at dinner, his certainty began to feel less like protection and more like something else entirely. Control, maybe. Or fear. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The weeks that followed that breakfast conversation felt like walking through thick fog. I went through the motions of finishing my senior year, attending classes, studying for final exams, but everything felt muted, distant. My father's words had created a crack in my foundation that seemed to widen with each passing day. I found myself second-guessing answers in chemistry class, hesitating when Dr. Martinez at the animal clinic asked for my opinion about a sick animal, wondering if every stumble or moment of uncertainty proved his point. Of Boston University's acceptance letter remained unopened on my desk. I'd applied for their pre-med program months ago, back when my future seemed clear and attainable. Now it sat there like evidence of my own delusion, a reminder of dreams that maybe were never realistic to begin with. The change in my behavior didn't go unnoticed. During lunch one Thursday in April, Morgan confronted me in the school cafeteria, sliding her tray across from mine with more force than necessary. "You've been acting like a zombie for 3 weeks, she said, unwrapping her sandwich with sharp, frustrated movements. "This is getting ridiculous, Kat. You're letting one conversation destroy everything you've worked for." "It wasn't just one conversation," I replied, picking at my apple slices. "It was my father telling me the truth about myself. That maybe I was too proud to see." Morgan's expression darkened. "Your father doesn't know everything about you. He doesn't know how you stayed up until 2 in the morning helping me understand protein synthesis. He doesn't know how you diagnosed that dog's heart murmur before the veterinarian did. He doesn't know that you're the only person in our AP biology class who actually enjoys dissection because you find anatomy fascinating rather than gross. But maybe enjoying something doesn't mean you're good enough to make a career out of it," I said. "Maybe there's a difference between being interested in science and actually having the intelligence to practice medicine." Morgan stared at me for a long moment, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder. She opened it and spread papers across the cafeteria table between us. "Test results, lab reports, recommendation letters from our teachers. Look at this," she demanded. "Really look. Your chemistry lab reports have been used as examples for underclassmen for 2 years. Mr. Henderson wrote in your recommendation letter that you have the most analytical mind he's encountered in 15 years of teaching. Dr. Martinez told you last month that you should consider veterinary school because you have natural diagnostic instincts." I stared at the evidence of my academic success, but my father's voice echoed louder than any grade or compliment. "Book smarts aren't the same as real intelligence." Morgan leaned forward, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Kat, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me. My mom works at the hospital where your dad has privileges. She's heard things." "What kind of things?" "Stories about how he treats residents and medical students. Apparently, he has a reputation for being particularly harsh with young women in training. There was an incident last year where a female resident quit her surgery rotation because of how he spoke to her during procedures." My stomach dropped. That doesn't mean anything. Surgery is stressful. He probably just has high standards. There's more. My mom heard from a nurse that your dad once told a medical student that women don't have the emotional stability for surgery. This was right in front of other doctors and students. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're making this up." "I swear I'm not. Mom didn't want to tell me because she knows we're friends, but she's worried about how his attitudes might be affecting you. She thinks he might be projecting his own biases onto his daughter." The cafeteria suddenly felt too loud, too crowded. Students laughed and chatted around us while my world quietly shifted on its axis. I'd always known my father could be demanding, perfectionist in his expectations, but the idea that his dismissal of my capabilities might be rooted in something deeper, something more troubling, had never occurred to me. That afternoon, I found myself in the school library, ostensibly studying for my advanced placement exams but actually researching my father's professional history online. What I found made my hands shake as I scrolled through article after article. Dr. Richard Brennan had been named in 3 malpractice suits over the past decade. 2 had been settled out of court, details sealed. The 3rd had resulted in a formal reprimand from the state medical board for what they termed unprofessional conduct toward medical staff. The reprimand was buried deep in public records, but it was there. I dug deeper, searching medical journals and professional publications. My father had authored several papers early in his career, but his publication record had virtually ceased about 10 years ago. Meanwhile, other orthopedic surgeons his age continued to contribute to medical literature, advance their fields, push the boundaries of surgical technique. A pattern began to emerge that chilled me. My father, the man whose medical expertise I'd never questioned, whose professional success I'd admired my entire life, appeared to have stagnated in his career. His practices were profitable, yes, but they focused on routine procedures, standard treatments, nothing innovative or groundbreaking. When I got home that evening, I found my mother in the garden, tending to her roses with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was avoiding something inside the house. She looked up as I approached, her face brightening with the automatic smile she wore whenever family members appeared. "Mom," I said, settling onto the garden bench beside her. "Can I ask you something about Dad's work?" Her hand stilled on the rose stems, and I saw that flicker of wariness cross her face again. "What do you want to know, sweetheart? Has he always been the way he is? So certain about everything? So quick to dismiss other people's ideas?" Patricia sat back on her heels, pulling off her gardening gloves with slow, deliberate movements. "Your father is a very accomplished man, Catherine. He's worked hard for everything he's achieved." That wasn't really an answer to my question, and we both knew it. I tried again. "When you were my age, what did you want to do with your life?" The question seemed to surprise her. She looked toward the house, where we could see Richard's silhouette moving around in his home office, probably reviewing patient files or updating surgical schedules. "I wanted to be a veterinarian," she said quietly. "I was accepted to Cornell's veterinary program. I deferred for a year to get married, thinking I'd start the next fall. But then I got pregnant with you, and your father thought it would be too much stress on the family for me to be in such a demanding program." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You gave up veterinary school for Dad." "I gave it up for our family," she corrected, but there was something hollow in her voice. "Your father was right that it would have been difficult to manage a marriage, a baby, and veterinary training all at once, but other people do it. Other women become veterinarians and have families." Patricia's smile was sad, resigned. "Other women don't marry men who need their wives to be available for their careers, their social obligations, their professional image. Your father required a certain kind of support that wouldn't have been possible if I'd been consumed with my own ambitions." I stared at her, seeing my mother clearly for perhaps the first time. This woman who organized charity luncheons, who managed the household with military precision, who smiled graciously at medical conferences and hospital fundraisers, had once dreamed of healing animals just as I dreamed of healing people. "Do you regret it?" I asked. She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then, still looking toward the house, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I regret that I didn't fight harder for what I wanted. I regret that I let someone else's fear of my success become my reason for failure. And I regret that I've watched my brilliant daughter begin to doubt herself because of the same patterns I was too weak to break." The admission hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. My mother had just confirmed that my father's dismissal of my medical school aspirations wasn't about protecting me from failure, it was about something else entirely. Control, maybe. Fear that the women in his life might prove as capable as he was, or more capable. That night at dinner, Mason mentioned that he'd been accepted to a summer program for gifted students in mathematics at Princeton. Richard's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "That's outstanding, son. Mathematics is the foundation of logical thinking. This program will set you up perfectly for engineering or computer science in college. You have real analytical ability." The praise was warm, genuine, proud. Everything that had been absent from his response to my college acceptances and medical school dreams. I watched Mason beam under our father's approval, and I felt a complex mix of happiness for my brother and bitter recognition of the difference in how our ambitions were received. Later that evening, I finally opened the Boston University acceptance letter. The words swam before my eyes as I read about their pre-medical program, their research opportunities, their track record of getting students into top medical schools. At the bottom, a handwritten note from the admissions counselor: "Catherine, your application essay about wanting to heal hearts was deeply moving. We look forward to supporting your journey toward becoming a physician." I thought about Dr. Martinez at the animal clinic, who had taught me to listen to heartbeats, to recognize the subtle signs of cardiac distress in dogs and cats. I thought about the elderly golden retriever whose life we'd saved last month when I'd noticed an irregular rhythm that everyone else had missed. I thought about the satisfaction I felt when pain became relief, when fear became trust, when my knowledge could make the difference between life and death. Then I thought about my father's words: "Too stupid, too sensitive, not capable." For the first time in weeks, the anger that followed was clean and pure. Not the muddy self-doubt that had been consuming me, but a sharp, clarifying rage at the injustice of having my dreams dismissed not because of my actual capabilities, but because of someone else's limitations. I picked up my phone and called Boston University's admissions office. When the automated system asked me to choose from a menu of options, I pressed the number for accepting admission offers. The next morning, I told my parents over breakfast that I'd be attending Boston University in the fall to study pre-medicine. Richard's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and Patricia's coffee cup trembled slightly in her hands. "Catherine, we discussed this," Richard said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of patient authority. "You're making an emotional decision that you'll regret, actually," I replied, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "I think the emotional decision would be letting fear keep me from pursuing what I'm passionate about. I've been accepted to one of the best pre-med programs in the country. My grades and test scores prove I can handle the academic rigor. And I've discovered that maybe the problem isn't my capabilities, but other people's comfort level with them." Richard's face flushed red. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're 17 years old, Catherine. You don't understand the realities of medical training, the demands of the profession, the level of commitment required." "Then I guess I'll find out for myself," I said. "And if I fail, at least it will be my failure to own, not someone else's fear that I never tried to overcome." The silence that followed was deafening. Mason looked between our parents and me with wide eyes, clearly sensing that something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamics. Patricia stared down at her plate, but I thought I saw the ghost of a smile at the corners of her mouth. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone flinch. "Fine," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "But when you wash out of organic chemistry or fail your MCAT or discover that you can't handle the sight of real human suffering, don't come crying to me for sympathy. I tried to save you from this humiliation." He left the kitchen, and moments later we heard his office door slam shut. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. So very proud." That afternoon, I drove to the animal clinic for my regular volunteer shift. Dr. Martinez met me at the front desk with a concerned expression. "Catherine, I heard through the grapevine that you might not be pursuing veterinary medicine. After all, I hope that's not true, because you have more natural instinct for animal care than most of my veterinary students." "Actually," I said, hanging up my jacket and reaching for my volunteer badge, "I've decided to go to Boston University for pre-med. I want to work with people instead of animals, but the diagnostic thinking is similar." His face lit up. "That's wonderful news. You know, my brother is a cardiologist at Massachusetts General. When you get to Boston, I'll make sure he knows to keep an eye out for you. Bright students like you are exactly what medicine needs." As I spent the afternoon checking on recovering animals, monitoring vital signs, and assisting with minor procedures, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Confidence. Certainty. The knowledge that my hands were steady, my mind was sharp, and my heart was in the right place. Whatever challenges lay ahead in Boston, whatever obstacles my father's doubts had planted in my mind, I would face them with the growing understanding that sometimes the people who claim to know us best are actually the ones who understand us least. And sometimes, proving them wrong isn't about revenge, it's about proving something to yourself. Boston University in September felt like stepping into a different universe. The campus buzzed with an energy I'd never experienced, thousands of students pursuing dreams that ranged from journalism to engineering to medicine. For the first time in months, I was surrounded by people who took intellectual ambition for granted, who assumed that if you were smart enough to be admitted, you belonged there. My dormitory was a towering brick building that housed mostly pre-med and science students. My roommate, Angela Rodriguez from Phoenix, was planning to become a pediatric oncologist. She spoke about treating children with cancer the same way other people discussed weekend plans, with confidence and determination that made my father's doubts seem not just wrong, but absurd. The first shock came during orientation week. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the pre-med advisor, stood before an auditorium filled with incoming freshmen and delivered statistics that should have been discouraging but somehow felt empowering instead. "Only about 60% of you will maintain the grades necessary to apply to medical school," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the large hall. "Of those who do apply, roughly 40% will be accepted somewhere. That means that statistically, fewer than a quarter of you will actually become doctors." Around me, students shifted nervously, but Dr. Chen wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "every single person in this room was admitted because our committee believes you have the intellectual capacity and personal qualities necessary to succeed. Your job isn't to worry about statistics. Your job is to prove us right." The difference between her approach and my father's was stark. Where he had focused on my limitations, she emphasized potential. Where he had predicted failure, she assumed success unless proven otherwise. For the first time since that awful breakfast conversation, I felt my confidence beginning to rebuild. My first semester courses were challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. Organic chemistry lived up to its reputation as a pre-med killer, with molecular structures and reaction mechanisms that seemed to shift and change depending on conditions I was still learning to understand. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, I found myself energized by the complexity. Study groups became my lifeline. Every evening, 6 or 7 of us would gather in the library's chemistry section, working through problem sets that seemed impossible. alone but became manageable when we tackled them together. Marcus Thompson, a quiet kid from rural Vermont, had an intuitive grasp of molecular behavior that helped me visualize reactions. Sarah Kim from California could memorize vast amounts of information and organize it in ways that made sense to the rest of us. 3 weeks into the semester, I called home to check in. My mother answered, her voice bright with genuine interest as she asked about my classes, my professors, my adjustment to college life. When Richard came to the phone, the conversation shifted. How are your grades so far? He asked without preamble. It's still early in the semester, Dad. We've only had a few quizzes. That's not what I asked. How are you performing compared to other students? I'm doing well. My organic chemistry professor used one of my lab reports as an example for the class. There was a pause. Catherine, excelling in undergraduate coursework is very different from handling the pressure of medical school. Don't let early success make you overconfident. Even hundreds of miles away, he could still plant seeds of doubt. But this time, something was different. Instead of the familiar spiral of self-questioning, I felt annoyed. Irritated that he couldn't simply be proud of my achievements without immediately undermining them. After hanging up, I found myself in Angela's room, venting about the conversation while she highlighted passages in her biology textbook. Your dad sounds like a piece of work, she said without looking up. My parents are the opposite. Sometimes I think they have more confidence in my ability to become a doctor than I do. What do you mean? Well, when I have a bad day or bomb a test, they remind me that everyone struggles sometimes. When I do well, they celebrate like I've already been accepted to Harvard Medical School. It's like they decided I was going to be a doctor when I was 12, and nothing that happens along the way is going to change that fundamental belief. I envied her that kind of support, but Angela's comment also made me realize something important. My father's opinion of my capabilities was just that, an opinion. It wasn't objective truth, medical fact, or divine judgment. It was the perspective of one person, colored by his own experiences, biases, and perhaps insecurities. That realization led me to start digging deeper into my father's professional background. The university library had access to medical databases and journals that I'd never explored before. What I found over the next several weeks painted a picture that contradicted everything I'd believed about Richard Brennan's medical expertise. His early career had been promising. Fresh out of his orthopedic surgery residency at a prestigious hospital in Philadelphia, he'd published several well-regarded papers on innovative surgical techniques. He'd been recruited by multiple practices, chosen to speak at medical conferences, recognized as a rising star in his field. But then, around the time I was born, something had changed. His publication record slowed, then stopped altogether. The speaking engagements dried up. He'd moved from a university-affiliated practice where he would have been expected to conduct research and train residents, to private practice focused entirely on routine procedures. More troubling were the patterns I discovered in medical board records and malpractice databases. Over the past 15 years, Richard had been named in 5 separate complaints, not just the 3 I'd found earlier. 2 involved allegations of inappropriate behavior toward female medical students. 1 concerned a surgical complication that other doctors suggested might have been avoided with more current techniques. Another involved a dispute with hospital administration over his treatment of nursing staff. The picture that emerged was of a man whose career had plateaued decades ago, who had become increasingly defensive about his methods and hostile toward innovation or challenges to his authority. Particularly challenges from women. Armed with this knowledge, I began to see my father's dismissal of my medical school ambitions in a different light. It wasn't protective concern for my well-being. It was fear that I might surpass his own achievements, might succeed in ways that would highlight his own professional stagnation. Meanwhile, my academic performance continued to strengthen. I earned the highest grade in my organic chemistry class on the midterm exam. My biology professor invited me to join her research team studying cardiac development in zebrafish, work that felt like a perfect bridge between my interest in hearts and my growing fascination with research methodology. Dr. Martinez at the animal clinic back home had kept his promise about connecting me with his cardiologist brother. Dr. James Martinez at Massachusetts General Hospital invited me to observe in his cardiac catheterization lab one weekend in October. Watching him guide tiny wires through coronary arteries, opening blocked vessels that had been choking off blood flow to struggling hearts, felt like witnessing miracles. You have good instincts, Dr. Martinez told me afterward as we discussed what I'd observed. You asked questions that showed you were thinking about the patient as a whole person, not just a collection of symptoms. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes for excellent physicians. His encouragement meant more than I could express, particularly because it came from someone with no investment in protecting my feelings or boosting my confidence artificially. He was simply observing my potential and commenting on what he saw. But the real breakthrough came during Thanksgiving break, when I returned home for the first time since starting college. The changes in family dynamics were immediately apparent. Mason, now a high school sophomore, greeted me with excitement about his own academic achievements and college plans. He peppered me with questions about Boston, about my classes, about whether I thought he'd like university life. My mother seemed lighter somehow, more animated than I'd seen her in years. Over coffee while Richard was at the hospital, she confided that she'd been volunteering at the local animal shelter, using the veterinary knowledge she'd gained in college to help with medical care for rescued animals. It's not the same as being a veterinarian, she said, but it feels good to use that part of my brain again. To remember that I once knew how to diagnose and treat and heal. What changed? I asked. Why now? She smiled, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Watching you stand up for your dreams reminded me that it's never too late to find ways to honor your own. I may not be able to go back and make different choices, but I can make better choices going forward. When Richard came home that evening, the shift in household atmosphere was palpable. Instead of the usual dynamic where his mood and opinions dominated family conversations, there seemed to be more space for other perspectives. Mason talked enthusiastically about his advanced placement courses. Patricia mentioned her volunteer work. And when I shared details about my research project and my observations in the cardiac catheterization lab, something interesting happened. Richard listened. He didn't interrupt with warnings about my limitations or predictions of failure. He asked a few technical questions about the procedures I'd observed, nodded thoughtfully at my descriptions of the research methodology, and then said something that surprised everyone. It sounds like you're getting excellent exposure to different aspects of cardiology. That's good preparation for medical school applications. The comment was grudging, almost reluctant, but it was the first acknowledgement he'd ever made that my medical school plans might actually succeed. Patricia caught my eye across the dinner table, her expression reflecting the same surprise I felt. Later that evening, as I was packing for my return to Boston, my mother knocked on my bedroom door. I need to tell you something, she said, settling into the chair by my desk. Something I should have told you months ago, when your father was trying to discourage you from applying to medical school. She took a deep breath, then continued in a voice that was steady but carried the weight of years of held secrets. Your father wasn't always the way he is now. When we first met, he was passionate about medicine, excited about research, committed to advancing surgical techniques. But something happened during his residency that changed him. What kind of something? There was an incident. A surgical complication that wasn't his fault, but the attending physician blamed him anyway. The attending was known for being particularly harsh with residents who showed too much independence or innovation. Richard's confidence was shattered, and instead of finding ways to rebuild it, he decided the safest approach was to stick strictly to standard procedures, avoid risks, and never put himself in a position to be criticized again. I stared at her, beginning to understand. So when he sees me taking risks, pursuing challenges, he projects his own fears onto my situation. Exactly. He's not trying to hurt you, Catherine. He's trying to protect you from the kind of professional humiliation that nearly destroyed him. But in doing so, he's forgotten that growth requires risk, that success often comes from pushing boundaries rather than staying safely within them. This revelation reframed everything. My father's dismissal of my capabilities wasn't based on objective assessment of my potential. It was based on his own traumatic experience with a profession that had both elevated and wounded him. His warnings about the dangers of medical school weren't prophecies, they were echoes of his own past pain. Understanding his motivations didn't excuse his behavior, but it did free me from the weight of his doubts. His fears belonged to him, not to me. His limitations didn't define my possibilities. When I returned to Boston for the spring semester, I carried with me a new sense of clarity about my path forward. The research project with Dr. Chen was expanding, and she'd suggested that our findings might be significant enough to warrant publication in an undergraduate research journal. My grades remained strong, my confidence continued to grow, and my vision of myself as a future physician felt more real and attainable with each passing day. But I also understood that proving my father wrong wasn't the goal anymore. Proving myself right was what mattered. And that journey was just beginning. Junior year arrived with the weight of MCAT preparation and medical school applications looming ahead. By this point, I'd established myself as one of the top students in the pre-medical program. My research with Dr. Chen had resulted in 2 published papers on cardiac development, and I'd been accepted into a competitive summer internship at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. The NIH internship changed everything. Working alongside graduate students and postdoctoral researchers, I was no longer the promising undergraduate with potential. I was a contributing member of a team studying innovative treatments for congenital heart defects. My project focused on understanding how certain genetic mutations affected heart muscle development. Work that could eventually lead to new therapeutic approaches for children born with cardiac abnormalities. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the principal investigator overseeing my research, was everything my father wasn't. She encouraged questions, welcomed challenges to established thinking, and pushed her team to consider possibilities that seemed impossible at first glance. Under her mentorship, I learned that real medicine wasn't about following protocols rigidly, but about thinking creatively within scientific frameworks. One afternoon in the lab, as I was analyzing microscopic images of developing heart tissue, Dr. Walsh approached my workstation with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Catherine, look at this data from yesterday's experiments. Your hypothesis about the timing of cellular differentiation appears to be correct. The control group shows exactly the pattern you predicted." I stared at the computer screen, hardly believing what I was seeing. The heart muscle cells I'd been studying for weeks were developing in ways that contradicted established timelines, exactly as my mathematical models had suggested they would. "This could change how we think about treating certain cardiac malformations," Dr. Walsh continued. "If we can manipulate the timing of cellular development, we might be able to prevent some heart defects from occurring in the first place." The implications were staggering. Instead of waiting for children to be born with heart problems and then performing complex surgeries to repair them, we might someday prevent those problems from developing during fetal growth. "I need to call someone," I said, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. "My mentor back home needs to hear about this." Dr. James Martinez at Massachusetts General listened intently as I described our findings, asking detailed questions about methodology and statistical significance. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Catherine, this is groundbreaking work. Have you considered presenting these findings at the American Heart Association's annual conference? I know several cardiologists who would be very interested in your research." The suggestion seemed impossible. Medical students and residents presented at conferences, not undergraduates. But Dr. Martinez was serious, and with Dr. Walsh's enthusiastic support, I found myself preparing an abstract for submission to one of the most prestigious cardiology conferences in the world. The acceptance email arrived 3 weeks later. My hands shook as I read the message informing me that my research had been selected for presentation in the Emerging Investigators category, a section reserved for the most promising young researchers in cardiovascular medicine. I called home immediately, barely containing my excitement as I shared the news with my mother. Her joy was immediate and unrestrained, but when Richard came to the phone, his response was more measured. "That's quite an achievement," he said, though his tone suggested skepticism rather than celebration. "Just remember that presenting research is very different from practicing clinical medicine. Don't let academic success convince you that you're ready for the realities of patient care." Even in this moment of triumph, he couldn't resist undermining my accomplishment. But instead of the familiar sting of doubt, I felt something else entirely: pity. Here was a man so threatened by his daughter's success that he couldn't acknowledge her achievements without immediately diminishing them. The conference presentation went better than I had dared hope. Standing before an audience of established cardiologists, cardiac surgeons, and researchers, I presented findings that could potentially revolutionize how we approach congenital heart disease. The questions afterward were thoughtful and engaged, treating me as a colleague rather than a student. After my presentation, Dr. Marcus Chen approached me at the reception. He was a cardiac surgeon from Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, renowned for his work on complex pediatric heart operations. "Ms. Brennan, your research is remarkable," he said, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "Have you considered cardiac surgery as a specialty? We need more surgeons who understand the molecular basis of heart development." I had been planning to focus on internal medicine, perhaps cardiology, but something about Dr. Chen's suggestion resonated deeply. Cardiac surgery represented the ultimate combination of intellectual challenge, technical precision, and immediate impact on patients' lives. "Actually," I said, "I've been fascinated by cardiac surgery since I first observed procedures as an undergraduate. But I assumed the training was too demanding, too competitive." Dr. Chen smiled. "The training is demanding, certainly. But so is the work you've already accomplished. Few undergraduates publish research that catches the attention of senior faculty at major medical centers. You clearly have the intellectual capacity and dedication necessary for surgical training." He handed me his business card. "When you're applying for medical school, consider institutions with strong cardiac surgery programs. And when you're ready to apply for surgical residencies, I'd be happy to discuss opportunities at Hopkins." The conversation left me reeling. Not only was a distinguished surgeon suggesting I had the potential for his field, but he was actively encouraging me to pursue the most challenging path in medicine. The contrast with my father's constant warnings about my limitations was stark and illuminating. Medical school applications consumed the fall semester of my senior year. The process was even more grueling than I'd anticipated, requiring not just academic transcripts and test scores, but personal statements, letters of recommendation, and interviews at multiple institutions. My MCAT scores arrived in October, 521 out of 528, placing me in the 99th percentile nationally. The number seemed surreal, a vindication of 4 years of studying, research, and determination to prove that my father's assessment of my capabilities had been wrong. This time, when I called home with the news, Richard's response was different. There was a long pause after I shared my scores, followed by what sounded almost like resignation in his voice. "Those are exceptional scores, Catherine. I suppose congratulations are in order." The admission was grudging, but it was the first time he'd acknowledged my academic achievements without immediately qualifying them with warnings or doubts. Progress, I thought, even if it came wrapped in reluctance. The interviews began in December. Harvard Medical School, Johns Hopkins, University of Pennsylvania, Washington University in St. Louis. Each interview felt like a validation of the path I'd chosen. Conversations with faculty members who were genuinely excited about my research background and surgical interests. At Johns Hopkins, I met with Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the director of the cardiac surgery residency program. She'd read my research papers and was familiar with my conference presentation. "We don't often see undergraduates with your level of research experience," she said during our conversation. "Most students interested in cardiac surgery don't discover that passion until medical school, sometimes not until residency. You're already thinking like a surgeon." "What do you mean?" "You see problems at the molecular level and immediately start thinking about how to fix them. Your research isn't just about understanding heart development, it's about finding ways to prevent cardiac defects from occurring." That surgical thinking applied to basic science. The observation thrilled me because it confirmed something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. My approach to scientific problems was indeed surgical, focused on intervention and correction rather than just observation and documentation. During winter break, I had an unexpected conversation that provided new insight into my father's behavior over the years. Mason, now 17 and preparing for his own college applications, asked me to help him with an essay about overcoming challenges. "What should I write about?" he asked as we sat in my old bedroom, college brochures spread across the desk. "What's been the biggest challenge you've faced so far?" He was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised me. "Living up to Dad's expectations while watching him tear down yours." I looked at my younger brother more carefully. Over the years, I'd been so focused on fighting for my own dreams that I'd missed how the family dynamics had affected him. "What do you mean?" Mason shifted uncomfortably. "Dad's always been proud of my achievements, but I've noticed that he only celebrates them when they're in areas where he feels comfortable. Math, engineering, computer science. But when I mentioned wanting to take art classes or creative writing, he shut it down just like he did with your medical school plans." The pattern was becoming clearer. Richard's control wasn't limited to fears about my capabilities, it extended to a need to keep his children within boundaries he understood and could dominate. "He's afraid of us surpassing him, isn't he?" Mason asked. "I think he's afraid of losing the role of being the expert, the authority figure whose knowledge can't be questioned." "That's really sad," Mason said. "Doesn't he realize that having successful children would reflect well on him as a father?" The question revealed the fundamental dysfunction in our family's approach to achievement. Instead of seeing our successes as extensions of his own, Richard viewed them as threats to his position. Spring semester brought medical school acceptances. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Penn, Washington University. Every school I'd interviewed with offered admission, several with significant research fellowships attached. The decision ultimately came down to Johns Hopkins, with its renowned cardiac surgery program and the opportunity to continue working with faculty who understood my research interests. When I called Dr. Marcus Chen to share the news of my acceptance, his response was immediate and encouraging. "Outstanding choice. You'll have access to some of the most innovative cardiac procedures in the world, and the research opportunities are unmatched. I look forward to working with you during your surgical rotations." The call to inform my parents about my medical school choice was more complex. Patricia's excitement was genuine and overwhelming, her pride evident in every word. Richard's response was more complicated. "Johns Hopkins is an excellent institution," he said, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite interpret. "Their cardiac surgery program is among the best in the country. It's a very competitive residency. To match into. I know, Dad. But my research background and recommendation letters should make me a competitive candidate." "Yes," he said quietly. "I suppose they should." There was something in his tone that suggested a shift, a grudging recognition that my path was not only viable but potentially exceptional. The daughter he'd once dismissed as too stupid for medical school was heading to one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the world, with faculty members already expressing interest in her surgical career. Her graduation from Boston University arrived with a mixture of celebration and anticipation. As valedictorian of the pre-medical program, I delivered a speech about the importance of challenging limitations, both those imposed by others and those we impose on ourselves. In the audience, my family sat together in the third row. Mason beamed with obvious pride, Patricia wiped tears from her eyes, and Richard sat quietly, his expression unreadable but attentive. After the ceremony, as we gathered for pictures and celebration, something unexpected happened. Richard approached me while the rest of the family was distracted by conversations with other graduates and their families. "Catherine," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I owe you an apology." I stared at him, uncertain I'd heard correctly. 4 years ago, when you told me you wanted to be a doctor, I responded from a place of fear rather than faith. I was afraid you'd experience the same professional disappointments that I had, and I thought I was protecting you from that pain. Instead, I nearly robbed you of opportunities to discover your own strength." The admission was more than I'd ever expected from him, an acknowledgement that his doubts had been about his own limitations rather than mine. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," he continued. "And I'm sorry it took me so long to say that." The moment felt like a door opening between us, not to the relationship I'd once wanted where he was my medical mentor and biggest supporter, but to something more honest and ultimately more valuable. A relationship where we could both acknowledge that his expertise had boundaries, and that my potential extended beyond those boundaries in ways that neither of us had fully understood. Standing there in my graduation cap and gown, medical school acceptance letters in my bag, and cardiac surgery residency programs already expressing interest in my candidacy, I realized that proving my father wrong had been less important than discovering who I actually was when his doubts weren't defining my possibilities. Medical school at Johns Hopkins was a crucible that tested every assumption I'd ever had about my own capabilities. The first year alone required memorizing more information than I'd learned in all 4 years of undergraduate study. Anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, pathology, pharmacology. Each course demanded not just rote memorization but deep understanding of how systems interconnected and influenced each other. My classmates were extraordinary. Sarah Park had graduated summa cum laude from Yale with a degree in molecular biology. David Williams had published 6 research papers as an undergraduate at Stanford. Maria Santos had spent 2 years working for Doctors Without Borders in Central America before applying to medical school. These weren't just smart people. They were exceptional individuals who had already proven themselves in demanding environments. Yet, within this competitive atmosphere, I found my footing more quickly than I'd expected. The research skills I'd developed as an undergraduate translated directly to medical education. When we studied cardiac physiology, my background in developmental biology gave me insights into how heart structures formed and why certain defects occurred. When we learned about surgical procedures, my experience with precise laboratory techniques made the concept of operating on human tissue feel less foreign. Dr. Amanda Foster, our anatomy professor, noticed my particular interest in cardiovascular structures during dissection labs. While other students focused on memorizing the names and locations of blood vessels, I found myself fascinated by the elegant engineering of cardiac circulation, the way evolutionary pressures had shaped a system that could pump blood continuously for decades without failure. "Catherine, you have an intuitive grasp of cardiovascular anatomy that's unusual for a first-year student," Dr. Foster observed after a particularly complex dissection of the heart's conduction system. "Have you given thought to which specialty you might pursue?" "I'm interested in cardiac surgery," I replied, carefully exposing the delicate electrical pathways that controlled the heartbeat. "The combination of technical precision and immediate impact on patients' lives appeals to me." She smiled knowingly. "Dr. Marcus Chen has mentioned your research background to several faculty members. He thinks very highly of your potential." The mention of Dr. Chen reminded me that my time at Hopkins wasn't just about surviving medical school, it was about positioning myself for one of the most competitive residency matches in all of medicine. Cardiac surgery residencies typically accepted only 1 or 2 candidates per year, and those positions went to students with exceptional academic records, extensive research experience, and unwavering dedication to the field. Second year brought clinical rotations, my first direct exposure to patient care. The transition from textbooks and laboratory work to actual human suffering was jarring. Patients arrived in emergency rooms with chest pain, shortness of breath, racing hearts, and crushing fatigue. Behind each symptom was a person terrified that their body was failing them, looking to medical professionals for answers and reassurance. My first rotation was internal medicine, where I learned to perform physical examinations, interpret diagnostic tests, and present cases to attending physicians. The work was demanding but exhilarating. For the first time, I could see direct connections between the theoretical knowledge I'd been accumulating and real solutions to human problems. During my cardiology rotation, I worked under Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a cardiologist who specialized in interventional procedures. She had trained at some of the same institutions where my father had once worked, and her approach to medicine was everything his was not. Where Richard had become defensive about new techniques, Dr. Walsh constantly sought innovative approaches to complex problems. Where he had grown rigid in his methods, she remained curious and adaptable. One afternoon, as we reviewed echocardiogram results for a patient with suspected heart valve disease, Dr. Walsh asked me a question that would prove prophetic. "Catherine, based on these images, what would you recommend for this patient?" I studied the screen carefully, noting the thickened valve leaflets and reduced blood flow. The textbook answer would be medication management followed by eventual surgical replacement if symptoms progressed. But something about the particular pattern of valve damage suggested a different approach might be more effective. "The valve structure looks like it might respond well to percutaneous repair rather than open surgery," I said carefully. "The damage is localized, and the patient is relatively young. A minimally invasive approach might preserve more natural function while reducing surgical risks." Dr. Walsh nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I was thinking. You're already reasoning like a cardiologist, not just reciting protocols." Her comment sparked something in me. I wasn't just memorizing medical knowledge, I was developing clinical judgment, the ability to synthesize information and make decisions that could improve patients' lives. The skills my father had claimed I lacked were not only present but growing stronger with each patient encounter. Third-year rotations included a month in cardiac surgery, an experience that would fundamentally change my understanding of what I was capable of achieving. Dr. Marcus Chen, who had encouraged my interest in the field since that first conference presentation, was now my attending surgeon. The cardiac surgery service operated on a different level of intensity than anything I'd experienced. Operations began at dawn and often continued past midnight. The cases were complex: heart transplants, valve replacements, repairs of congenital defects in children, emergency procedures for patients whose hearts were failing catastrophically. My first time in the operating room as part of a cardiac surgery team was overwhelming. The patient was a 65-year-old man whose coronary arteries were so severely blocked that medication could no longer maintain adequate blood flow to his heart muscle. Without surgical intervention, he would die within weeks. Dr. Chen allowed me to assist with opening the chest, a procedure that required cutting through the breastbone with a specialized saw. The sound was disturbing, but what struck me most was the weight of responsibility. This man had placed his life entirely in our hands, trusting that our knowledge and skills could restore his heart to function. As the operation progressed, Dr. Chen began teaching me to tie surgical knots, to handle delicate heart tissue, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated how well a repair was functioning. My hands, which had seemed clumsy and uncertain during my first attempts at suturing, began to move with increasing confidence and precision. 3 hours into the procedure, as Dr. Chen was creating new pathways for blood flow around the blocked arteries, something unexpected happened. The patient's heart rhythm became dangerously irregular, threatening to derail the entire operation. "Catherine," Dr. Chen said calmly, "I need you to apply gentle pressure to the posterior wall while I adjust this graft. Can you do that?" My hands moved without conscious thought, positioning themselves exactly where he'd indicated. The heart tissue felt warm and alive under my fingers, and I could feel the irregular contractions gradually stabilizing as Dr. Chen completed his repair work. Later, in the recovery room, as we monitored the patient's vital signs and confirmed that blood flow to his heart had been successfully restored, Dr. Chen pulled me aside for a conversation that would stay with me for years. "You have natural surgical instincts," he said quietly. "Most medical students are nervous about handling heart tissue, afraid they'll cause damage. You moved with confidence and precision, as if you understood intuitively how much pressure to apply and where to position your hands." I felt honored by his assessment, but also confused. How could I have instincts for something I'd never done before? "Some people are natural teachers, others are natural researchers," Dr. Chen explained. "You appear to be a natural surgeon. Your hands know what to do before your mind has fully processed the situation. That's not something that can be taught. It's something you either have or you don't." The rotation continued with increasing complexity. I assisted with valve replacements, participated in pediatric heart surgery, observed heart transplant procedures that lasted more than 8 hours. With each case, I felt my skills and confidence growing, my understanding of cardiac anatomy deepening beyond what any textbook could provide. But the most significant moment came during my final week on the service. We received an emergency case, a 45-year-old construction worker who had suffered a massive heart attack. His left anterior descending artery, sometimes called the widowmaker because blockages there are often fatal, was completely occluded. The patient arrived unconscious, his heart barely functioning despite maximum medical support. Dr. Chen assessed the situation quickly. Emergency surgery was the only option, but the risks were enormous. The man's heart tissue was already severely damaged, and any surgical intervention might cause complete cardiac arrest. Catherine, Dr. Chen said as we prepared for the operation, I want you to be first assistant on this case. I need someone with steady hands and good judgment, because we're going to be working at the very limits of what's surgically possible. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating. As first assistant, I would be directly involved in every aspect of the procedure. Not just observing but actively participating in efforts to save this man's life. The operation was unlike anything I'd experienced. The patient's heart was so damaged that normal surgical approaches wouldn't work. Dr. Chen had to improvise, creating novel solutions to problems that weren't covered in any textbook. My role was to anticipate his needs, provide precise assistance, and make split-second decisions about how to handle complications as they arose. 4 hours into the surgery, we encountered a crisis that tested everything I'd learned. As Dr. Chen was attempting to restore blood flow to the damaged heart muscle, the patient's blood pressure dropped precipitously. His heart was failing, unable to pump effectively even with mechanical assistance. I need you to massage the heart manually, Dr. Chen instructed, his voice calm despite the emergency. Gentle, rhythmic pressure to help maintain circulation while I complete this repair. My hands moved to the patient's exposed heart, feeling the weak, irregular contractions under my palms. For several minutes, I literally kept this man alive through manual cardiac massage while Dr. Chen worked to restore natural function to the damaged muscle. When his heart finally resumed normal rhythm and his blood pressure stabilized, the operating room erupted in quiet celebration. We had saved a life that seemed beyond saving, using skills and knowledge that represented the pinnacle of medical achievement. Dr. Chen looked at me across the operating table, his eyes visible above his surgical mask. Catherine, in 20 years of cardiac surgery, I've rarely seen a medical student handle that kind of emergency with such composure. You may have just discovered your calling. The experience was transformative in ways that extended far beyond surgical technique. For the first time, I fully understood what it meant to hold someone's life in your hands, to make decisions under pressure that could mean the difference between life and death, to combine technical skill with clinical judgment in service of healing. When I called home that evening to share the experience with my family, my mother's pride was overwhelming. But Richard's response surprised me with its thoughtfulness. That sounds like extraordinary experience, Catherine. Emergency cardiac surgery requires exactly the kind of quick thinking and steady hands that define excellent surgeons. You're clearly developing skills that go well beyond what I ever imagined possible. The admission was significant because it represented not just acknowledgement of my current achievements, but recognition that my potential extended into areas where his own expertise couldn't guide or limit me. I was becoming something he had never been, an innovator, a surgeon who could handle the most complex cardiac cases, a physician whose skills were being recognized by faculty at one of the world's leading medical institutions. But even as I celebrated these milestones, I had no idea that my father and I were on a collision course that would test both of our medical knowledge in the most personal way imaginable. 4th year of medical school brought the intensity of residency applications and the weight of choosing a specialty that would define the rest of my career. By this point, my interest in cardiac surgery had crystallized into unwavering commitment. I had published 4 research papers on innovative surgical techniques, received outstanding evaluations from every rotation, and earned strong recommendation letters from faculty who had watched me develop from promising student to skilled clinician. The cardiac surgery residency application process was unlike anything else in medicine. Programs typically interviewed only 20 to 30 candidates nationwide for 1 or 2 positions. The competition included graduates from Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and other elite institutions, many with impressive research backgrounds and surgical experience. Dr. Marcus Chen called me into his office one afternoon in October to discuss my application strategy. His expression was serious but encouraging as he reviewed my academic record and clinical evaluations. Catherine, you have one of the strongest applications I've seen in recent years. Your research contributions are substantial, your clinical skills are exceptional, and your letters of recommendation are uniformly outstanding. However, I want you to understand the magnitude of what you're attempting. He pulled out statistics from recent years showing match rates for cardiac surgery positions. The numbers were sobering. Less than 70% of applicants matched into programs, meaning nearly 1 in 3 highly qualified candidates would need to pursue alternative specialties. The pressure is enormous, Dr. Chen continued. The training is longer and more demanding than any other surgical specialty. The learning curve is steep, the hours are brutal, and the stakes are always life and death. Are you absolutely certain? This is the path you want. I thought about the construction worker whose heart I had manually massaged back to life, about the children with congenital defects who would grow up with normal cardiac function because of surgical intervention, about the research I was conducting that might prevent heart disease altogether. I've never been more certain of anything, I replied. This is what I'm meant to do. Interview season began in December and continued through February. I traveled to cardiac surgery programs across the country: Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Stanford University Medical Center. Each interview was an intensive evaluation that included presentations of my research, discussions of complex cardiac cases, and assessments of my technical skills and clinical reasoning. The interview at Cleveland Clinic proved particularly significant. Dr. Robert Harrison, the program director, was known for asking candidates to solve hypothetical surgical scenarios that tested both technical knowledge and decision-making under pressure. You're operating on a 60-year-old patient with severe aortic stenosis, he began, describing a case where the heart's main valve was so narrowed that blood flow was severely restricted. During the procedure, you discover that the valve is more calcified than imaging had suggested, and standard replacement techniques won't work. The patient is on cardiopulmonary bypass, and you need to make a decision quickly. What do you do? The scenario was designed to test my ability to think creatively under pressure, to adapt when standard approaches failed. I considered the options. Aborting the procedure would leave the patient with a life-threatening condition, but attempting an unconventional repair carried significant risks. I would use a modified technique I've read about in recent literature, I replied, describing an innovative approach that involved removing calcium deposits manually and reconstructing the valve using the patient's own tissue. It's more technically demanding than standard replacement, but it preserves natural valve function and reduces long-term complications. Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of creative problem-solving we look for in cardiac surgery residents. Most candidates would have chosen the safer option, even though it provides suboptimal results for the patient. The validation was encouraging, but I knew that interview performance was only one factor in residency selection. Programs also considered research potential, clinical skills, and intangible qualities like resilience and determination. Match day arrived in March, the culmination of months of anxiety and anticipation. Medical students across the country gathered to learn simultaneously where they would spend the next phase of their training. The process was both celebration and lottery, with careers determined by sealed envelopes opened at precisely noon Eastern Time. I stood in the auditorium at Johns Hopkins, surrounded by classmates who had become friends and rivals over 4 years of intense study. My hands trembled as I held the envelope that would determine whether my dream of becoming a cardiac surgeon could proceed or whether I would need to reconsider everything I'd planned. At exactly noon, I tore open the envelope and read the single line that would change my life: "Congratulations. You have matched to the Department of Cardiac Surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital." The relief was overwhelming. Not only had I matched into cardiac surgery, but I would be staying at Hopkins, working with faculty members who already knew my capabilities and research interests. Dr. Markuschan found me in the crowd afterward, his smile reflecting genuine pride. "Catherine, this is just the beginning. Residency will test you in ways that medical school never could. But I have complete confidence that you have what it takes to succeed." That evening, I called home to share the news with my family. My mother's excitement was immediate and effusive, her pride evident in every word. Mason, now a college sophomore, studying biomedical engineering, expressed amazement that his sister would soon be performing heart surgery, but Richard's response was the most meaningful. His voice carried a weight of emotion that I hadn't heard before, a mixture of pride, regret, and something that sounded almost like awe. "Catherine," he said quietly, "I owe you more than an apology. When you first told me you wanted to be a doctor, I responded from my own limitations rather than your possibilities. You've achieved something that most physicians only dream of. Cardiac surgery residency at Johns Hopkins represents the pinnacle of medical training." He paused, and I could hear him struggling with words that didn't come easily. "I was wrong about you. Not just wrong about your capabilities, but wrong about what those capabilities could become with proper support and encouragement. You've proven that determination and talent can overcome even the most discouraging circumstances." The admission was more than I had ever expected from him, an acknowledgement that his doubts had been fundamentally misplaced and that my achievements represented something he hadn't thought possible. Residency began that July with an intensity that made medical school seem leisurely by comparison. The cardiac surgery service operated with military precision, beginning each day at 5 in the morning with case presentations and continuing until all patients had been seen, all operations completed, and all emergencies addressed. My co-residents were exceptional individuals who had distinguished themselves at their own medical schools. David Park had graduated first in his class at Harvard and published extensively on artificial heart technology. Jennifer Walsh had developed new techniques for minimally invasive cardiac procedures as a medical student at Stanford. Michael Chen had spent 2 years conducting research at the National Institutes of Health before beginning residency. Despite this competitive environment, I found my skills developing rapidly. The foundation of technical expertise I had built during medical school translated well to the demands of residency. My research background helped me understand not just how to perform procedures, but why certain approaches worked better than others. 6 months into residency, I received news that would bring my medical training full circle in the most unexpected way. My mother called one evening as I was reviewing surgical cases for the following day, her voice tight with worry and barely controlled fear. "Catherine," she said, "your father is in the hospital. He had chest pain this afternoon, and the emergency room doctors think he's having a heart attack." The irony was not lost on me. The man who had once claimed I was too stupid for medical school was now facing the possibility that his own heart was failing, potentially requiring exactly the kind of cardiac intervention I was training to provide. I drove to New Jersey that night, arriving at the hospital where Richard had privileges as an orthopedic surgeon. The cardiology team had stabilized his condition, but diagnostic tests revealed severe blockages in multiple coronary arteries. The damage was extensive enough that medication alone would not be sufficient treatment. Dr. William Torres, the attending cardiologist, explained the situation to our family in terms that were both clinical and compassionate. "Your father has what we call triple vessel disease. All 3 major arteries supplying his heart muscle are significantly blocked. He needs cardiac surgery, probably multiple bypass grafts, to restore adequate blood flow." The treatment Richard required was complex, demanding, exactly the kind of procedure I had been learning to perform. As Dr. Torres discussed surgical options and risks, I found myself thinking like the cardiac surgery resident I had become, analyzing the case from a technical perspective while simultaneously processing it as a daughter whose father's life was in danger. That night, sitting in the cardiac intensive care unit beside Richard's bed, watching monitors display the rhythm of his compromised heart, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 7 years earlier, he had dismissed my medical school aspirations as unrealistic dreams. Now, his survival would depend on physicians who had followed the same path I was pursuing, who had developed the same skills he had once claimed were beyond my capabilities. When he woke from sedation the following morning, his eyes found mine immediately. For a long moment, we looked at each other without speaking, both understanding the profound irony of our situation. "Catherine," he said finally, his voice weak but clear, "I need you to know something. Watching you become the doctor I never believed you could be has been the most humbling experience of my life. And now, as I face the possibility of cardiac surgery, I'm grateful that there are surgeons in the world who didn't listen to people like me when we said they weren't capable of healing hearts." The admission was more powerful than any apology he could have offered. An acknowledgement that his limitations had never been mine, and that my success represented not just personal achievement but vindication of every student whose dreams had been dismissed by authority figures who confused their own fears with objective assessment. The surgery was scheduled for the following week at a major cardiac center in Philadelphia. As I prepared to return to Baltimore to continue my residency training, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible when this journey began. "Dad," I said, standing beside his hospital bed, "I want to be there for your surgery. Not as your daughter, but as a cardiac surgery resident who can understand what's happening and help our family navigate the process." His eyes filled with tears as he nodded, finally understanding that the daughter he had once tried to discourage from pursuing medicine had become someone who could guide him through the most frightening medical experience of his life. The roles had completely reversed. The man who had once claimed superior medical knowledge was now dependent on the expertise of physicians following the path he had tried to deny me. And I had become not just a doctor, but specifically a cardiac surgeon who could literally understand his heart in ways that he, despite his medical degree, never could. The cardiac surgery suite at Philadelphia Presbyterian Hospital was a cathedral of modern medicine, filled with technology that could sustain life while hearts were stopped, repaired, and restarted. I stood in the observation gallery above the operating room, wearing surgical scrubs that identified me as a visiting resident from Johns Hopkins, watching as the surgical team prepared for my father's triple bypass operation. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the lead cardiac surgeon, had graciously allowed me to observe despite the obvious conflict of interest. She understood that sometimes medical training and family obligations intersect in ways that require professional accommodation. My presence served a dual purpose. I could provide my family with real-time updates about the procedure's progress, and I could learn advanced techniques that would enhance my own surgical education. Richard lay unconscious on the operating table, his chest draped and prepared for the incisions that would access his failing heart. The monitors surrounding him displayed the vital signs that would guide the surgical team through the next 4 hours: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and the electrical rhythm of cardiac muscle that had served him for 58 years but now required mechanical intervention to continue functioning. As Dr. Morgan made the initial incision through his sternum, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 7 years ago, this man had sat across from me at our kitchen table and declared me too stupid for medical school. Now, his survival depended entirely on the skills and knowledge of physicians who had followed exactly the path he had tried to deny me. The operation proceeded with the precise choreography that defines cardiac surgery. Dr. Morgan and her team connected Richard to the heart-lung bypass machine, stopping his heart while the artificial system maintained circulation throughout his body. In the temporary silence where his heartbeat should have been, they began the delicate work of grafting healthy blood vessels around the blocked coronary arteries. I watched through the observation window as they harvested a section of his mammary artery and sections of vein from his leg, then carefully attached these grafts to create new pathways for blood flow. Each connection required microscopic precision, perfect technique, the kind of technical skill that comes only from years of intensive training and countless hours of practice. 2 hours into the procedure, Dr. Morgan looked up toward the observation gallery and nodded, a signal that the most critical phase of the surgery had been completed successfully. The grafts were in place, the connections secure, the new pathways ready to restore blood flow to Richard's oxygen-starved heart muscle. When they restarted his heart and weaned him from the bypass machine, the monitors immediately showed improvement. His cardiac output increased, his blood pressure stabilized, and the electrical rhythm displayed the regular pattern of a heart that was once again receiving adequate oxygen supply. I remained in the hospital throughout Richard's recovery, dividing my time between his bedside and consultations with his medical team. My cardiac surgery training proved invaluable in understanding the subtleties of his post-operative course, interpreting changes in his vital signs, and communicating with nurses and physicians about his progress. On the 3rd day after surgery, as he was transitioning from the intensive care unit to a regular cardiac floor, Richard asked to speak with me privately. His voice was still weak from the breathing tube, but his mental clarity had returned completely. "Catherine," he began, his words slow and deliberate, "I need to tell you about something that happened while I was under anesthesia. I don't know if it was real or just the effects of medication, but I had what felt like a conversation with my father. I listened carefully, knowing that patients sometimes experienced vivid dreams or hallucinations during cardiac surgery due to the effects of anesthesia and the stress of the procedure. He told me that he had made the same mistake with me that I was making with you," Richard continued. "He had discouraged my medical school ambitions because he was afraid I would surpass his own achievements. He said the pattern had to stop with me, that I needed to become the father who supported his daughter's dreams instead of limiting them." The revelation provided context for Richard's behavior that I had never understood. His dismissal of my capabilities hadn't originated from objective assessment of my potential, but from a generational pattern of parents who felt threatened by their children's ambitions. Whether the dream was real or symbolic didn't matter. What mattered was that Richard seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, how his fears had nearly robbed me of opportunities to discover my own strength. "I've been watching you these past few days," he said, his eyes focusing on mine with new clarity. "The way you talk with my doctors, the questions you ask, the way you understand my condition better than I do despite all my years in medicine. You've become everything I said you couldn't be, and more than I ever imagined possible." He paused, struggling with emotions that seemed too large for words. "I'm not just proud of what you've accomplished, Catherine. I'm grateful that you didn't listen to me when I tried to convince you that your dreams were impossible. You saved yourself from my limitations, and in doing so, you may have saved me too." The admission was profound because it acknowledged not just his mistakes, but the broader implications of what had happened. By pursuing cardiac surgery despite his discouragement, I had developed skills that could now benefit him and countless other patients whose hearts needed healing. Richard's recovery progressed smoothly, aided by his excellent physical condition and his newfound motivation to participate fully in cardiac rehabilitation. I returned to Baltimore to continue my residency training, but our relationship had fundamentally changed. Instead of the dynamic where he questioned my medical knowledge, he now called me regularly for advice about his recovery process, his medications, his exercise program. The role reversal was complete and permanent. I had become the medical expert in our family, the one whose knowledge of cardiac physiology and surgical techniques exceeded his own. But rather than using this position to diminish him as he had once tried to diminish me, I found myself committed to supporting his recovery and helping him understand his new medical reality. 6 months later, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone in our family. He announced that he was retiring from orthopedic surgery and enrolling in a master's degree program in medical education. His plan was to become a teacher, focusing specifically on mentoring young women and underrepresented minorities in medicine. "I want to spend the remainder of my career undoing the damage I may have caused," he explained during one of our weekly phone calls. "There may be students out there who have been discouraged from pursuing medicine because of attitudes like mine. If I can help even a few of them overcome those barriers, maybe I can balance the scales." The transformation was remarkable. The man who had once embodied the kind of gatekeeping that keeps talented people out of medicine was now dedicating himself to opening doors for others. His near-death experience had catalyzed a complete re-examination of his values and priorities. My own career continued to flourish. By my third year of residency, I was performing complex cardiac procedures with increasing independence. My research on congenital heart defects had resulted in several published papers and invitations to present at international conferences. Faculty members began discussing my potential for an academic career, possibly returning to Johns Hopkins as an attending surgeon after completing fellowship training. The patients I treated came from all backgrounds and circumstances, but they shared the common experience of hearts that had failed them in some way. A construction worker whose arteries were blocked by years of smoking. A young mother with a congenital defect that had finally progressed beyond medical management. An elderly professor whose heart valve had calcified beyond repair. Each case reinforced my understanding that cardiac surgery was about more than technical skill. It was about restoring hope to people whose bodies had betrayed their dreams. One afternoon during my fourth year of residency, I received a call from Dr. Marcus Chen asking me to come to his office. When I arrived, I found him reviewing applications for the following year's cardiac surgery fellowship positions. "Catherine," he said, looking up from the papers on his desk, "I want to discuss your plans after residency. Several programs have expressed interest in having you as a fellow, including our own Advanced Cardiac Surgery Fellowship here at Hopkins." The opportunity he was describing represented the pinnacle of cardiac surgery training, an additional year of subspecialty education that would prepare me to handle the most complex cases, to pioneer new surgical techniques, to become a leader in the field. "I've been thinking about staying here," I replied. "Hopkins has provided me with incredible training opportunities, and I feel like I could contribute to the research and education missions of the program." Dr. Chen smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. We'd like to offer you our fellowship position for next year, with a focus on pediatric cardiac surgery and surgical innovation. It would involve clinical work, research, and teaching responsibilities." The offer was everything I had dreamed of when I first decided to pursue cardiac surgery. But it also represented something deeper, validation that the path I had chosen despite my father's doubts had led not just to personal success, but to opportunities to advance the field itself. That evening, I called home to share the news with my family. Richard's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Catherine, that's extraordinary. A cardiac surgery fellowship at Johns Hopkins will position you to become one of the leading heart surgeons in the country. I couldn't be more proud of what you've achieved." The pride in his voice was genuine, unmarked by the qualifications and warnings that had once characterized his response to my accomplishments. He had finally learned to celebrate my success without feeling threatened by it. 5 years after completing fellowship, I was appointed as an attending cardiac surgeon at Johns Hopkins, specializing in complex congenital heart repairs and innovative surgical techniques. My patient load included some of the most challenging cases in pediatric cardiac surgery. Children born with hearts so malformed that survival required multiple operations and years of careful management. Richard, now in his second year of teaching medical students about the importance of diversity and inclusion in medicine, often visited my operating room to observe procedures. Watching him interact with students reminded me of the father I had always wished he could be: encouraging, supportive, focused on helping others discover their potential rather than limiting it. One morning, as I was preparing for a particularly complex operation on a 6-month-old baby with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, Richard approached me in the surgical lounge. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of reflection, "I need to tell you something I should have said long ago. Watching you work these past few years, seeing the lives you've saved and the techniques you've pioneered, has taught me what medicine is supposed to be about. It's not about protecting territory or maintaining hierarchies. It's about healing, innovation, and passing knowledge to the next generation." He paused, looking toward the operating room where my patient was being prepared for surgery. "You didn't just prove me wrong about your capabilities. You showed me what I could have been if I hadn't let fear and insecurity limit my own potential. Thank you for that gift." As I entered the operating room that morning, preparing to repair a heart so small it could fit in my palm, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who had once been told she was too stupid for medical school was now performing surgeries that would give children normal lives, conducting research that would prevent heart defects in future generations, and teaching residents who would carry these skills forward. The 6-month-old patient survived the 8-hour operation and grew up to become a healthy, active child whose repaired heart function was indistinguishable from normal. His parents sent me updates every year on his birthday, photos of a boy whose life had been saved by techniques that might never have been developed if talented people had listened to those who said their dreams were impossible. Richard lived for another 15 years after his cardiac surgery, long enough to see me become department chief, long enough to watch his grandchildren grow up knowing that their aunt could literally repair hearts, long enough to understand that his greatest contribution to medicine hadn't been his own surgical career, but his daughter's achievement in spite of his initial doubts. At his memorial service, I delivered a eulogy that acknowledged both his flaws and his ultimate transformation. He had been wrong about my capabilities, wrong about the nature of medical excellence, wrong about who deserved opportunities to heal. But he had also been brave enough to recognize those mistakes and spend his final years trying to correct them, standing at the podium, looking at an audience filled with medical students, residents, and faculty whose careers he had encouraged rather than limited. I realized that our story had become something neither of us had originally intended. It wasn't just about a daughter proving her father wrong. It was about the power of persistence to transform not just individual lives, but generational patterns of thinking about who gets to dream and who gets to heal. Today, I continue performing cardiac surgery, teaching residents, and conducting research that pushes the boundaries of what's possible in treating heart disease. My father's doubts about my capabilities have become footnotes in a career that exceeded even my own early expectations. But the real victory wasn't proving him wrong. The real victory was discovering that when we refuse to accept other people's limitations as our own, we sometimes find that our potential extends far beyond what anyone imagined possible, including ourselves. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.